And let's get more now on the death of Alexei Navalny. Deutsche Welle correspondent Arthur Sullivan joins us from Berlin. Arthur, hello. So how have European leaders reacted to Alexei Navalny's death?
Well, the news of Alexei Navalny's death came as a huge shock to European leaders, even though it wasn't entirely surprising given how things have gone for so many opponents of Russian President Vladimir Putin over the years, and given how Navalny himself had been treated since returning to Russia in 2021, having been poisoned just before that. Now, European leaders made it very clear that they held the Russian state and its leader responsible for Navalny's death, and they emphasised that it showed just how undemocratic and brutal the repression of the Russian state has become under Putin, and particularly since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago this week. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said Navalny had, quote, paid for his courage with his life, and that his death showed just how much Russia had changed. The French President Emmanuel Macron said the death showed that in Russia, free spirits were sent to the gulag and condemned to death. Since then, of course, the story has moved on. As you said, Navalny's body has not been released to the family, and Russia, according to Navalny's family, is trying to delay things as long as possible. Navalny's widow, Yulia Navalnaya, met with European foreign ministers earlier this week for a discussion about what possible steps they should take, and she made it very clear as well that she holds Putin responsible for her husband's death, and she urged the EU to take some sort of action.
And so what does this mean in terms of new sanctions against Russia?
Well, given that the tide of the war does appear to have swung in Russia's favour recently, and also that the Russian economy, which was of course hit with various sanctions over the last 2 years, given that that's doing better than many in the West expected it to, this issue of new sanctions have been on the table in Europe for a while, but the death of Navalny has really increased the urgency. So when she met the foreign ministers, Ms Navalnaya said Europe should not recognise, for starters, the legitimacy of the upcoming presidential election in Russia. That wouldn't be a sanction, but it would be a huge statement. Now, the ministers were meeting anyway to discuss the latest round of sanctions, and there does appear to be a new package about to be agreed, possibly even today or certainly later this week. Now, those sanctions are not directly going to be about Navalny. They're going to target around 200 individuals and businesses connected to the invasion, but there may be some symbolic sanctions related to Navalny. For example, they may target some people involved in the prison where he was held. But also, as you said, the fact that the US have now said they're going to agree some major new sanctions, that does again put some more pressure on Europe.
What about the broader question of European financial support for Ukraine and investment in its own security for the years ahead?
Well, on that question, the EU a few weeks back did agree a €50 billion financial support package for Ukraine, and despite grumbling from sort of countries a little bit closer to Putin, like Hungary, the EU does clearly remain committed to its financial support of Ukraine, even though it's obviously difficult to keep on agreeing those new packages. But that big question there, in terms of investment in Europe's own security, that's a different question, and that's not going to go away. The recent comments from former US President Donald Trump that he would encourage Russia to attack a NATO country if it did not meet its spending commitments on security, they were greeted with horror across Europe, particularly given Trump's chances of winning the US presidential election later this year. So these fears that America could pull back from its long-established major security role in Europe under a second Trump presidency are really growing. Now, Europe has really ramped up its arms production over the last decade, really, but in particular in the last few years since the invasion, although many security experts say it's still nowhere near enough to make the continent able to defend itself in a possible absence of American leadership. However, one important point, European countries which are members of NATO, they're spending more and more on their security. Back in 2014, there were just 3 NATO members which met the target of spending 2% of their GDP on defence. This year, it's going to be 18 members. But here's the thing. For a long time, this question itself was dormant. It wasn't even discussed, and that's not the case anymore. In fact, it's now probably more of a live issue than at any stage since the Cold War. And given what's happening in Russia, given what's happening in Ukraine, it's only going to become a bigger question.
OK, Arthur Sullivan there in Berlin.